I welcome you back to the Generation N. It's been quite a bit since we first got acquainted, and after a month later, I feel it's time for you and I to get back together again. Top of the world. Let me stop fooling around. Nah, but last time we left off, we focused on the burnout that Gen Z is already facing while just entering the workplace and got into the meat and potatoes of why that burnout is prematurely happening and what I think could be done to prevent it. I talk about how I feel like there's a section of Gen X and authority who are apathetic towards Gen Z's lack of experience in the workplace, alongside their concern about the declining stability the workplace provides in this era of unaffordability. I'm surprised that's not a word, but I really think it should be one. The irony is how Gen X and authority undermines the impact this unaffordability era is having on their employees, even within their own generation. If you ask me, I believe that Gen X has it the worst out of all of us. But before we go deeper, I would like to introduce all of us millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha to Generation X. The generation, also known as the forgotten generation, since they're fewer than those of the baby boomer generation and us millennials and Gen Z. They're often known as the latchkey kids coming from school to arrive to an empty home as their parents were still at work. And as a result, Gen X developed the traits of independence, of resourcefulness, alongside mastering work and life balance due to experiencing the heavy demand of their parents' work, causing absence from family life. Gen X are defined as cynical, which comes from the economic droughts they've experienced as children and young adults. So it's safe to say that Gen X is no stranger to this current economic crisis that all generations are facing. And even on the verge of entering their senior era, Gen X finds himself searching on how to overcome that financial strife as they try to prepare for that retirement they've always dreamed of. Last time I made a reference to a Medium article by Rocco Pendola called Gen X Did a Lot Right and Still Got Screwed, in which he discussed how Gen X was sold a dream, in which if they worked hard, got a job that paid well, bought a home, maxed out their 401k for retirement, that they would be guaranteed that life of stability. However, this was a blueprint that was only successful under temporary conditions for early boomers and even the silent generation that didn't have to deal with the economic setbacks before Reaganomics was ever considered a thing that paved the way for later economic droughts, such as the 2008 housing crisis, the Great Recession, and this current recent inflation that's caused by this pandemic. And as a result of these series of droughts, their opportunity of a comfortable retirement, once available for boomers in silence, has nearly eroded for Gen X. Sorry, this is New York City. Damn ambulances. But referring back to that article, Pendola cites this encouraging statistics. 22% of Gen X has nothing saved for retirement. 48% of Gen X has below $50,000 saved for retirement. 67% believe they'll need above $1 million to retire comfortably. 12% believe they'll be able to retire when they're 65. Just 12%. 15% believe that they'll never retire. I mean, given how expensive everything has become, especially within the last 5 years, I mean, how can you expect Gen X to truly be prepared for that comfortable retirement? I mean, it's gotten so bad that Gen X and even millennials are finding themselves having to, prematurely tap into their 401k savings to cover rising costs of living in various areas. And Gen X case is having to care for both their children and aging parents simultaneously. Recent studies reveal that the average cost of raising a child in a middle-income family is nearly $20,000 per year. And of course, this amount increases even further with parents' ambitions of preparing their kids for college by covering their tuition. And even this whole subject of college alone is even losing its value, which will have its own episode in the near future. On the other side of the spectrum is Gen X's parents, representing the boomers in the silence. More than half of Gen Xers in their 50s, I think 59%, have aging parents they help alongside their kids. And while it's a blessing for them to witness the staying power and presence of their parents, I mean, you certainly can't overlook the amount of work it takes to keep them around. And you can believe that this work becomes, even more difficult when helping parents with more severe ailments. There's that saying that of how important it is to put your loved ones first. Now, coming from a late millennial myself, I wholeheartedly agree with that on a personal level, as I would have never turned out to be who I am today if not for the way I was raised by my parents. And I've also got to witness the infinite amount of love my mom had for my grandmother. So much that in her final stages, I watched my mom care for my grandmother intensively. My mom could have easily checked out, threw her hands up, and just put my grandma in a nursing home, but no. She cared for my grandmother at home out of the pure love she's had for my mom. And while I commend my mom for her ability of being able to go deep inside herself to find that inner strength to care for my grandmother and her final years, at the same time, I can tell you from a personal experience how much that really took out of her to accomplish a feat like this. It drained so much out of her that she never truly had that proper time that she needed, my mom, to focus on her own needs. And now, at 60 years old, she's playing catch up as we speak, and I believe she's holding up well, thankfully. However, I bring up my mom's experience as it's that kind of experience that's common for a lot of Gen Xers, being devoted on the ones dearest to them and their inner circle at the expense of their own well-being, especially being able to prepare for that comfortable retirement that they've been sold the dream of. And you can be sure that this completely adds on to that burnout that they're already dealing with in the workplace. And when you're caught in that vortex of taking care of your loved ones and your family that can't, whether it be because they're not quite ready yet to face the real world because they're kids, or they become so vulnerable after being in the real world for decades, you have to make sure that sacrifice for those who have invested into you. And of course, this goes for any parents, regardless of the generation. You have to make that sacrifice for those who are looking up at you, children in dire need of that same investment that your parents made in you. It's essentially the unwritten rule for everything that our parents have done for us and what we need to do to prepare our kids. Certainly you cannot withdraw from returning that favor. Come on. However, given the climate Gen X finds themselves in, the question arises is that how can this generation in particular feel more supported as they rightfully commit to helping their parents and children simultaneously? What can employers do to step in? I mentioned in our last episode how I believe employers should engage in this conversation of how they can help Gen Z adapt in the workplace. Well, there's another conversation I believe employers need to have in regards to Gen X, who represent the workhorses of not only of their profession, but within their family. As I said before, this generation has it harder than anyone else. So employers should be asking the question of what can be done to better assist Gen X in self-care, at least from a financial standpoint, to relieve some of this burnout they experience both professionally and personally. I feel that this generation should be acknowledged and rewarded for what they have contributed professionally, not only professionally, but personally and their family. And I believe employers can start by acknowledging that vortex that Gen X finds themselves in that takes away from their investment of self. And because of this anxiety and doubt Gen X has towards retirement, perhaps the start of initiatives and where employers personally meet with their Gen X employees to talk about their feelings and stance towards retirement. And once the employees' feelings are taken into consideration, employers can reach out to the financial masterminds they know personally and connect them to Gen X employees who are insecure about their financial status. And one survey conducted by the PwC discovered that 41% of the workforce feels that they were never given the tools to manage a serious economic crisis that have taken place, within the last 4 decades. So when it comes to that statistic in particular, I believe employers and financial experts, working in unison to help all employees, especially Gen X, prepare for economic droughts that we're currently witnessing, through at least education, will at least take some of the anxieties and worries off our plate and eliminate some of the burnout previously like we touched on in the very first episode. This particular education and finances can remove the anxiety enough to where we can become possibly more productive in our professions now that we potentially see a clear path. It's basically the compound effect, if you know what I mean. As for the Gen X employees, specifically the early half of this generation pushing this retirement age, I believe it's like 65, I believe the financial experts should help them explore the possible routes they can take to potentially expedite the process if they do exist. I don't know if we'll ever see the resurgence of pensions and public companies ever again that provided a guaranteed monthly income minus that personal investment risk. As someone who champions for widespread pensions, after myself learning about how companies actually went bankrupt from just providing pensions, I can partially understand why it can't return to the prominence the way it did in the 80s. In substitution, we now have the 401k plan, of course, and where the responsibilities of funding retirement now fall solely on the employees. And it's quite alarming to find out that there are still employers out there that do not match their employees' contributions. Well, I say to those employers, what you waiting for? It's time to wake up and acknowledge that financial burden your senior workers have been dealt, in spite of committing most of their life to keeping these companies running efficiently. I know us millennials and Gen Z have our expectations of what we want from employers, but I acknowledge Gen X for how much they have poured into and even outside the workforce to raise us kids, and they are rightfully owed for how much they gave. So I believe employers should return the favor. If pensions will never return, at least you can return their favor by matching their 401k 50% to 100%. This type of return is essentially a way of saying thank you for everything that you've done to help this company thrive. And even if for some reason that Gen X has to delay their retirement for a couple of years, at least I believe they'll experience that satisfaction in knowing their employer's appreciation for all their contributions, and now the employers will have the improved resources to show their gratitude. But another question, are there other alternatives for Gen X in the workplace if they have to delay their retirement? There's been this talk for years of a 4-day work week for employees and the satisfying benefits. The benefits of less hours while receiving the same pay. Yes, that sounds good. And more importantly, less burnout. And I believe this could definitely benefit Gen X employees, as of course it definitely takes some amount of stress they've been already dealing with. And we're starting to see this 4-day work week implemented, and with an increasing number of private employers experimenting with this vision in the States. Even in New York and New Jersey, legislation proposals exist to test 4-day schedules for certain public employees. And as I previously said, this would definitely work well for Gen X. This could potentially be the break they need, just like all of us, to focus on ourselves. But in the meantime, I believe if this conversation does not gain any traction, which ultimately becomes action, soon Gen X employees could find themselves suffering the same decline as their parents they care for. The physical, mental, spiritual decline caused by the burnout from juggling that many responsibilities all at once at the expense of their own well-being. And of course, this burden that Gen X had to carry will also pass down to millennials, then down to Gen Z. It essentially becomes another generational curse that needs to be prevented before it even starts. We talked about the stress that Gen X faces with focusing on self while having to take care of their children. But what happens when their stress, Gen X's stress level increases when being devoted to kids that are addicted to social media that robs them of their mental health and self-being? Stay tuned for our next episode of The Generation In. I hope to see y'all soon.